threshold of children was approximately €520,000. Now, 10 years later, we're looking at a 33% rate and a tax-free threshold of €310,000. To put that into context, if you have a client who holds assets of €2 million and 4 children, in 2008 his children would not have paid any CAT, but now they'd have a combined CAT liability of €250,000. Because of this, I find that frequently clients are much more willing to look at their will structure and to see whether there's anything that can be done. Because I think when the rate was 20% and there was kind of a €500,000 tax-free threshold, they kind of thought, oh well look, maybe a fifth of the estate in tax isn't so bad. Whereas now it's a third of the estate, which just, I think, it even seems like a much bigger chunk, and clients have a bit more of an appetite to look and see if there's anything that can be done to tax efficiently plan their estate. I mentioned earlier that there is a tax associated with discretionary trusts, because Revenue didn't like the fact that the CAT liability was delayed and that they weren't getting any tax, so they introduced discretionary trust tax. Discretionary trust tax is an initial tax charge of 6% of the value of the trust fund, and then every year from year 2 onwards there's a 1% annual charge arising on the 31st of December. Now the 6% initial charge would be reduced back to 3% if the trust is wound up within 5 years. And while if you have a trust that's running for say 4 years, you might be looking at about a 5% discretionary trust tax charge, which is an additional tax charge, but hopefully if the trust is there, it's there for a purpose. So it might be there for the beneficiaries to avail of one of the reliefs from CAT, such as maybe business relief or agricultural relief. And both of those reliefs are 90% reliefs from CAT, so they reduce the effective rate of CAT to 3.3% in respect of business property and agricultural property. So then that can be contrasted, that tax saving on CAT can be contrasted with the additional tax cost of the discretionary trust tax that's incurred, but there would still be a large overall saving in tax. I'm now going to touch on the reliefs and exemptions from CAT, but given the time constraints today, I don't have time to go into all of the conditions of the release. That is in the paper that I believe you all have, so I'm just really going to touch on kind of some points to note in relation to these reliefs. Firstly, agricultural relief was significantly tightened up in Finance Act 2014, and it's a relief that applies to agricultural property anywhere in the EU, so it's not limited to Ireland. And it's not just limited to agricultural property, it also includes crops, underwood, trees, farm buildings, machinery, livestock, so it can cover a significant number of assets. The changes that were introduced in 2014 mean that the conditions of the relief are now that the farmer test is still there, so that a beneficiary, after taking the gift or inheritance, has to have 80% of their assets comprising agricultural property. But now also there's a requirement that the beneficiary either farms the land for 6 years, or that the beneficiary leases the land to a person who farms the land for 6 years. There's another requirement that the beneficiary or the lessee, as the case may be, has either an agricultural qualification or that they spend a minimum of 50% of their working time farming the land. And then there's also the requirement that the land must be farmed on a commercial basis with a view to the realisation of profits. Finance Act 2017 made some minor changes to this relief, and it just provided that agricultural relief will apply in circumstances where land is used for the purpose of solar energy production, provided that a minimum of 50% of the land is used for that purpose. Business relief is another relief that is frequently used by many individuals who want to transfer a family business to the next generation, and it was designed to prevent the breakup of family businesses. Again, as with agricultural land, it's a 90% relief. It's a 90% reduction in the value of the business property, so it reduces the effective rate of CAT down to 3.3%. And there are holding requirements, so that a disowner must have held the chargeable business assets for either 2 years in the case of an inheritance or 5 years in the case of a gift. And then in the case of a transfer of company shares, there are also requirements that the beneficiary holds either a certain percentage of the votes in the company or the issued share capital in the company after receiving the gift or inheritance. There are clawbacks for both business relief and agricultural relief, so that if the property is disposed of within 6 years and not replaced, that a clawback of the relief arises. Dwelling house exemption then is one that has significantly changed in the last 2 years. Prior to Finance Act 2016, it was widely available to the broader taxpayer community who say agricultural relief or business property relief would not have applied to, and it allowed any person to transfer a dwelling house to any other person free of CAT, provided that the conditions of the relief were met, which were just that a beneficiary had to have lived in the property for 3 years prior to the transfer, 6 years post, and had no interest in any other dwelling on the date of transfer. However, we did know that Finance Act was under review, and we were expecting it to be changed in some respect. Perhaps we thought maybe there would be a cap introduced because there was no limit on the level, on the value of the property that could transfer. And because of this, and because of continued reports of misuse of this exemption, in Finance Act 2016, Revenue completely changed the landscape with regard to this exemption and severely restricted it. And I think went much further than certainly was expected and possibly was needed, such that the exemption now only applies in the context of a gift to a dependent relative. And a dependent relative is a person who's over the age of 65 or who is incapacitated. And again, Finance Act 2017 just made a technical change to this to clarify that in the case of a gift or inheritance of a dwelling house to a dependent relative, there's no need that the property that the property was the main residence of the disposer prior to the date of transfer. So it could apply to any property. Because that was, I was just going to go on to say that that was a change that was brought in by Finance Act 2016, in that in the context of an inheritance, the exemption is still there, but it only applies provided that the disposer lived in the property as his or her main residence at the date of death, and also provided that the beneficiary also lived in that property for 3 years prior to the date of inheritance. So effectively it now means that dwelling house exemption only applies in an inheritance tax context with regard to the family home, because it's where the disposer had to be living at the date of their death, and also the beneficiary had to be living there for 3 years prior to receiving the property. Just to quickly mention favourite niece or nephew relief, this can be quite useful in that it increases the tax-free threshold of the favourite niece or nephew where the conditions of the relief are met, from a Group B, which is currently €32,500, to Group A, which is €310,000. Just one point to flag with this is that if there are assets passed into the niece and nephew and they comprise a mix of both business assets and non-business assets, you could have two tax-free thresholds applicable, because the Group A tax-free threshold might apply to business assets, and then you'd have the Group B tax-free threshold for the other assets. Again, I'm just going to briefly touch on the reliefs exemptions from CGT, the main ones being retirement relief and entrepreneur relief. So retirement relief applies where an individual is disposing of all or part of his business or farming assets, and there are a number of conditions that apply. The first being that the individual has to be over the age of 55, and then there are different thresholds or certain limits which for the market value of assets that can qualify for the relief, depending on whether the disposal is to a child, and if the individual is between the age of 55 and 65, that's actually unlimited. Any market value of assets can transfer. But if the individual is over the age of 66 and transferring assets to a child, there's a limit of €3 million on the value of assets that can pass under this relief. And then, in the case of disposals to persons other than a child, the limit between the age of 55 and 65 is €750,000, and above 66, it's €500,000. Just to note that with this relief, individuals don't actually have to retire from the business, so they could still remain involved in the business, but they can transfer assets to their children as the case may be. And another minor point to mention is that if an individual is claiming retirement relief in a year, they can't claim the annual exemption from CGT of €1,270. It's just a minor point, but something that's often overlooked. Entrepreneur relief is a relatively new relief under Section 597AA of the Taxes Consolidation Act, and it applies to qualifying business assets, and again there are a number of conditions as to what assets will be qualifying business assets. Initially the rate of CGT under entrepreneur relief was 20%, but as in from 1 January 2017, this is reduced to 10%. So there's a lifetime limit of €1 million gain which can qualify for this rate of CGT at 10%. So it's quite a valuable relief, and it's certainly something that should be considered. But I think, in a practical sense, you won't be looking at any of these reliefs in isolation. If a client comes to you with a proposal to transfer assets, it's likely that you're going to be looking at a number of reliefs and the interaction of those reliefs with each other. So, for example, if you have a client who wants to transfer shares in a family company to his children, on that transfer, that will give rise to CGT for the transferor, but then you need to consider, okay, is the client over the age of 55? Will retirement relief apply? And also consider if there's any excess gain that isn't covered by retirement relief, whether entrepreneur relief applies, so that excess gain could perhaps be subject to a 10% rate of CGT rather than the 33% standard rate. Such a transfer would also give rise then to CAT for the beneficiary, but again, you'd be looking at, does business property relief apply? Can you get that 90% reduction in the value of business assets? Just to mention a few other exemptions that are sometimes overlooked. Firstly, the CGT-CAT offset, which was also mentioned by Claire, whereby you are entitled to a credit against your CAT liability in respect of CGT already paid, provided that both taxes arise on the same event. And that's the critical point. It has to be the same transfer that gives rise to both taxes. Again, there's a clawback if the property which the beneficiary receives is disposed of within 2 years. The small gift exemption is something which might seem minor in that it's a 3,000 exemption in respect of a payment from any person to any other person each year, but it can add up. If you have parents or grandparents, so if you have a couple, that's €6,000 between them. And if they're transferring to children, say if there are 3 children in a family, parents or grandparents can get across €18,000 per annum tax-free to those children. So that could be going into a bank account and building up. Another use of the small gift exemption, which has become more common recently, is that grandparents are frequently looking to set up education funds for their grandchildren where they have excess wealth. And over the course of, say, 10 years, grandparents could actually get across approximately €90,000 tax-free to those grandchildren through the use of the €6,000 combined small gift exemption each year, and also the tax-free threshold of €32,000. So when you look at it like that, in a 10-year period, it really can add up, so it's definitely something worth considering. The support and maintenance exemption, this is under Section 82 of the CAT Act, and again until Finance Act 2014, it was quite a broad relief in that it exempted any appointments for the purposes of the support, maintenance or education of a child from CAT. Now, from 1 January 2015, as a result of Finance Act 2014, this has been tightened up so that the CAT exemption will now only apply in respect of appointments for the support, maintenance or education, which are made to either a minor child, so a child who's under the age of 18, or to, if a child is over 18, provided that child is between the age of 18 and 25 and in full-time education, or in full-time training for a vocation. The exemption continues to apply in respect of appointments to incapacitated individuals who are any age. There's no age limit on that. And just another thing to bear in mind with regard to this exemption is that it will only apply in respect of appointments which are deemed to be normal expenditure. So, for example, a parent paying for their child's college fees but not buying them a house, because that would be abnormal, so. And Revenue have outlined this in the CAT manual. They updated their guidance last October. Finally, interest-free loans are something that are becoming more popular again recently due to the restrictions to dwelling house exemption, because parents are looking at ways to get money across to their children to allow them to get a foothold on the property ladder. I would just flag that pursuant to Section 40 of the CAT Act, if a parent makes an interest-free loan to a child, that child is deemed to take a gift on 31 December each year in respect of the free use of money as a result of the interest-free element. And the amount of that gift is deemed to be the best deposit rate that the parent would have gotten if they put those funds on deposit. So there are tax considerations to using interest-free loans, and perhaps it might not always be appropriate to actually make the loan interest-free. It might be more tax efficient to apply an interest rate and perhaps to write it off each year, or to apply an interest rate and to allow it to roll up and not be paid until the repayment date. But you need to consider income tax implications also, as well as VAT implications. So I would just say that you look at that closely rather than simply just a parent making an interest-free loan to a child and thinking there are no tax consequences. My final slide is just a few tips for estate planning. Just to run through these very quickly, you might, in the case of spouses, they might wish to consider putting the assets into joint names so that they would pass outside the terms of a will and make the administration of the estate easier, but that isn't always appropriate. So, it depends on the clients themselves and their wishes. I would suggest that you recommend to clients that they make a tax-efficient will if possible and review it every 3 years to take into account any changes in either personal circumstances or tax changes. If there are any assets held abroad, it's very important to get local advice, certainly for real properties. I would really stress that. If an individual wishes to make any lifetime transfers, they should make sure that they have more than sufficient assets to look after themselves for their lifetime and for any unforeseen eventualities. And also, if they are considering lifetime transfers, look at any tax reliefs and make sure that it can be done tax efficiently, and that it isn't that it wouldn't be more tax efficient to pass the assets under a will. Also, just utilising the small gift exemption. That's something that's small, but it's very easy to do. Parents can just set up an annual payment, and that money can build up over time. And you might also wish to consider using the tax-free thresholds not only of children in a will, but also passing the tax-free threshold amount to grandchildren, so that you're getting an extra €30,000 across to all of the grandchildren tax-free. Some people are also happy to provide the tax-free threshold amounts to their children-in-law, but that varies from individual to individual. And finally, just to mention Section 72 policies, again, they're coming into fashion recently, so it just to assist children having liquidity to discharge their CAT liabilities. So that's something that you might wish to consider. So that's it. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Sarah, folks travelled down from Dublin to speak to us today. So just before you leave, if there's any questions you'd like to put to Claire and Andrea now, or I'm sure they'd be happy to take questions privately.
There's one question for Claire there. When you were speaking about the offshore matters, and you said when will they arise, and you mentioned CAT returns prior aggregable benefits.
Sure.
And you mentioned incomes or gains earned abroad. I just didn't follow what you were saying there.
I suppose there are two separate things. What I'm saying is, if there was a prior aggregable benefit, and that benefit, say, was a holiday home abroad, and that holiday home has since been let, so they've received an inheritance or a gift, and has there been an income derived from that benefit since it was received? So I suppose it's just something that may come up when you're discussing the matter with your client, in terms of, and you just need to be aware that there may be tax issues there, that on the face of it they were under their threshold, and they weren't required to make a return, but something may have happened subsequently that gave rise to the income stream. So if they have been asked abroad, has there been an income gain arising from that asset, is basically what I'm saying. Okay.
Two questions. First for Claire. A recent audit on residential exemption, which went to about round 16, not about the revenue. The last question they asked me in writing was to hand over my tax advice. Is that appropriate?
I would have thought that was very unusual.
Everything about it was unusual, but this was round 16, and it was the last question they asked.
That is very unusual. I mean, your advice to your client that's precluded. So I'd be asking for their legal basis.
Well, they've withdrawn the audit since they closed it.
Yes. There's no legal basis for that request. I mean,
You haven't seen that before, no?
No, your advice to your client is privileged. They may, I suppose...
Even before the arrangement, or we say tax planning, was in the course of tax planning. I mean, obviously it's not a court situation, so it's not
I suppose there is certain exceptions to the rule where it's tax advice as opposed to legal advice, but that is in the context of, I suppose that's in the context where they've issued an order, or they're, I suppose, in that situation, they are investigating with a view to prosecution. So in normal circumstances, I would say there be no exception to that rule, that you'd be required to hand over advice.
Just another question. You mentioned about discretionary trusts that there had to be a class of beneficiaries. I understood that a discretionary trust can arise simply where you have one beneficiary and where you have discretion as to whether you accumulate income or capital.
Yes, sorry, that is true. A discretionary trust, the definition is where income is can be accumulated, so that could be a discretionary trust, yeah.
Sorry, just one other question. You mentioned about a fixed trust for children becoming a certain age, okay, we say 25. Is that totally immune from distribution? If children are of age, can they not call for the funds to be distributed if they're of full age or full capacity?
If all of the children agree, so if all of the beneficiaries agree under the rule in Saunders and Vautier, they can agree to wind up the trust and call on the trust.
But they can force it, I think.
They can, yeah. So they can call on the trustees to transfer it to them. But that's it, provided all of them are of age and have capacity and they all agree.
Sorry, just on that, in that context, if it's provided that it's conditional on them reaching the age, then can they still force it before they're of that age?
No, you're into some very complex tax rules there. The trustees effectively, I mean, they can, if it's a conditional legacy, but you're then into, if they don't reach that age, then the tax needs to be recalculated, and it's a point we've actually been looking at in the office quite a bit recently, because often people are getting themselves in, the way wills are drafted, they say provided or upon them reaching, which essentially then means that the trustees have to hold on to the assets to see whether they do reach the age or not. So it's a very technical tax point that it's...
Can you provide that, would say, identify the beneficiary, they'll receive the income until they're, say, 25, and then they can access the asset?
Well, then you're into a fixed trust there, and there'd also be a CAT liability for them on their right to receive the income for that period. They'll be deemed to have an interest in possession, so they'll have a CAT charge for that, as well as paying income tax on the income.
Yeah. Sorry, but was that on the capital or on is the income accumulated?
I'm sorry, I thought you just said that the income will be paid to them.
The income will be distributed, so they pay income tax on the income.
Yeah.
But are you saying that
they would also pay CAT on the fact that they have a right to receive the income
is
first?
that on the same capital that they would say going to inherit when they're 25?
Well, no, there's, if you have a right to receive the income for a specified period, say between the age of 18 to 25, that in itself gives rise to a separate CAT charge.
Oh, yeah.
And then there would also be a CAT charge when they receive the capital at the end.
Oh, yeah.
So they're deemed to have an interest in possession for that period, which is a separate CAT liability.
Sorry, can I ask another question just in the context of the discretionary trust? And in the context of where provision is being made for a child with a disability. And this is in the context of, we'll say, where they would qualify for social welfare benefits or other means-tested benefits. Is the fact that they are named as a beneficiary in the discretionary trust taken into account in that context?
No.
Even though they have no right to it?
No, because they're not absolutely entitled to it. So for a discretionary trust which is established for an incapacitated person, I would suggest that you include as beneficiaries that person, and also any charity who might be providing services to people with disabilities. And so there's more than one beneficiary there, and they can't be deemed to be absolutely entitled. So if you set up a discretionary trust for an incapacitated person, it won't affect their assessment for state benefits.
But it would say if their name was the only beneficiary,
yeah,
but it's on a discretionary basis,
yeah,
how are they treated then?
well, I would
entitlement to it, but at the same time it's recognised that they can be the only one who can benefit from it.
I would always include a charity. I wouldn't establish, because you need that flexibility there, so I wouldn't recommend establishing a trust just for that beneficiary. And also in order to qualify for the exemption, how the trust fund is distributed on that beneficiary's death, it has to be in accordance with the rules, so that either it passes to the beneficiary's spouse or children, or if they don't have any, it has to be divided, distributed amongst charities. So you should have a charity included as a beneficiary.
Okay, so the provider would say that they would be the sole discretionary, would say beneficiary for a discretionary period, and at the end of the life of the named beneficiary, that would pass back to maybe that person's siblings.
You can, you can do that to provide that it will go to the siblings and if when they pass away.
Does that affect the exemption from?
No, because this will be at the end of the trust period, so when the trust is over, which would come about because of the death of the named beneficiary.
So in that case, then you wouldn't need to put in a charity as well.
Pardon?
You wouldn't need to put in a charity then.
I always would. I would always recommend including a charity.
So a charity for the lifetime of the bit of
Not for the lifetime, it's just.
Then after the lifetime.
No, the charity may never benefit. You're just including a charity in the class of beneficiaries, but they may never benefit.
So what in effect you're saying is that you transfer life interest in the property to the trust fund. So the trust fund is in effect life interest for the life of the incapacitated person, and therefore there's no difficulty having the charity. There's no point that interest terminates on his death automatically.
Not necessarily. A life interest is different. A life interest is just a limited interest in the trust fund, so that
you put the life interest into a discretionary trust.
It's not really a life interest, because the likelihood is that all of that trust fund can be appointed out. It's not just the income that will be appointed out, it's also the capital. So all of that capital is likely to be appointed out to that beneficiary for their benefit during their lifetime. So just they're separate things. It's not, it is technically, it's established for the benefit of that beneficiary's life, but like all discretionary trusts established for children, typically I would say that the trust would end when the last of the children dies, or if there are grandchildren included, when the last of them dies. But that doesn't mean it's a life interest trust necessarily.
I think what he's saying is that you want to be careful that the property doesn't go to the charity, that there are other siblings included as well.
So you deal with that in the ultimate default clause for the trust. Yeah. That sets out how it should be distributed on the death of the incapacitated person.
A question for Claire. Claire, if someone has a holiday home abroad, just coming back to that question, and there's no income being generated, it's just a pure holiday home, were our clients required to declare it? Is there any issue on a future sale or as an inheritance for children? Will there be any issue? From a revenue perspective, it was never declared as an asset, even though it's not income generating, foreign asset held abroad with no income.
I suppose the question is, are the assessable person, like have they filed tax returns? Is it a chargeable asset they acquired? It may have been required to have been returned on their, if they were filling out Form 11. It really depends on the circumstances of the individual. But I suppose the key issue is if there hasn't been income generated from it, then there shouldn't be a tax liability arising from it. And that's the key really.
Just wondering, in an agricultural context, rights of maintenance and support, have you any views on how to limit, we say, the liability on the assessor of those rights? Because it's, as property is becoming, agricultural property is becoming more valuable, I think the revenue are taking far greater regard, having far greater regard to the assessor of rights, and they can fall back in as non-agricultural assets. Just wonder, have you any views on how to limit the additional tax that might arise?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Transfer of lands,
Yep.
subject to rights of maintenance and support.
Yep.
I think a lot of people will probably just adopt the administrative formula, which if you have two parents, it's 20% plus 20%, so you have 40% reduction ticking in to start with by just ticking that box. You're constrained to that gift falling back in at 40% again. Because if you go out in 40%, it comes back in on the administrative basis. If you go up the statutory basis, it comes back in the statutory basis. I'm just wondering, have you any views on how to...
I'm afraid that isn't something I've come across before. I'd be happy to chat to you afterwards if you wish, and I could look into it, but I haven't actually come across that.
But it is a problem. I mean, if people are claiming the reduction at the administrative level, which is 20% to 20% for two people, it's a huge inheritance coming back in again on the death of the parties. I mean, not for the first parent, but maybe the second parent. And it could well be non-agricultural, their assets may have changed, their configuration may have changed, so it doesn't necessarily fall back into the estate. the child at agricultural rate.
Okay. No, as I said, I haven't come across that. I'm afraid. No.
Sorry, one other question. In the context of dealing of the private principal residence relief, and where there are other properties in the estate, that if you basically say provide an immediate gift or inheritance of the residence, but provide that the other properties may, we say, pass to a trust for a short period of time, even just for a matter of a few months, rather than invest directly in the intended beneficiary. Would that be effective? And what traps are in there?
I think it possibly could. Again, because the exemption is now so restricted, one of the main hurdles that you're going to have to come over in most cases is that both the disposer and the beneficiary lived in the property together, because where you've adult children now, that's unlikely to arise. But that possibly could work. So it certainly could be looked into. Yeah.
Just in the context of the decision that the appeal, I gather that you're challenging the.
They are that case that they're appeal. Yeah. So it'll be interesting, because that case certainly is set a precedent now. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of what the outcome of the appeal is.
Two short questions. Number one, you mentioned about making an appeal to the appeals commissioner.
Yes.
There. And you said that revenue can object to the appeal on the basis that either a return was not made, tax return was not made, or the tax was not paid. Do you have to pay the tax before you can make
This is the tax that you said was due
that you said is
according to the return that you
Right.
filed. So
the tax that-
you need to have filed your return and calculated the tax yourself if you
Right.
believe that is due. It may be nil.
Okay, you did that. Right. The other question is for Andrea. Short question. Retirement relief. You mentioned for persons between 55 and 65, they can leave a limitless amount, or they can dispose of a limitless amount of property to a child without CGT. What about if you just simply sell it on to a stranger? What's the limit there?
So that's the other section, that's section 598. And between the age of 55 and 65, the limit is 750,000, and from 66 onwards, it's 500,000 euro. Yeah.
I think that's it. So thank you, everybody.
Get out of the box every